After a night's sleep, Julian found himself swept up in his mother's holiday agenda, making the obligatory rounds to visit relatives. They ended up at his uncle's house. His mother, despite living in London for years, had forgotten none of her American competitive spirit and immediately joined a boisterous game of poker at the dining table. Julian was relegated to the living room floor with his younger cousins, navigating a tense game of Settlers of Catan. His two 30-something cousins had wisely made themselves scarce, seeking refuge from the inevitable interrogations about their life choices. The bond between the siblings and cousins was strong. Julian passed his younger cousins some cash for the holidays. They accepted it without ceremony, then immediately started pestering him with inquiries about his band. They had found out the previous year that Julian had formed a band in college and was even playing gigs. To a pair of teenagers, this was the pinnacle of coolness. But Julian just shrugged, explaining that the band was teetering on the brink of failure. He painted a bleak picture of the local music scene, claiming it was mostly filled with uninspired wannabes, with the genuinely talented ones already signed or scouted. He jokingly included himself as a rare, overlooked gem. He advised them to focus on their studies and keep guitar as a hobby, telling them any thoughts of touring would have to wait until after college. In unison, they rolled their eyes at him. His female cousin, Mia, sighed dramatically, informing him that he sounded just as annoying as her dad. Julian laughed, admitting it was a curse of adulthood. Once you graduated high school, you aged at an accelerated rate. Mia shuddered at the thought as she rolled the dice, contemplating whether graduation was even worth it. But then she remembered she was only 15, and such weighty concerns were still a long way off. Julian spent the afternoon entertaining his cousins. It wasn't until evening that he found a quiet moment to video call Caleb. A single day apart was hardly enough to induce a profound sense of longing, but he'd grown accustomed to their daily check-ins. He huddled on the back porch, recounting the day's trivial events, from his male cousin's terrible report card to Mia's secret new nail art. He then proudly showed Caleb the wad of cash from his relatives, boasting that it was enough to fund their next few dates. In his family, anyone unmarried was still eligible for holiday cash gifts. Caleb smiled, listening from his dorm room while simultaneously working on a research paper. Julian squinted at the screen, a jumble of incomprehensible medical terminology. He was taken aback by Caleb's diligence during the holiday break. He questioned if Caleb ever took time off. Caleb replied that, with nothing else to do, working was a form of relaxation for him. Julian found this method of unwinding peculiar. Their conversation drifted aimlessly until Mia poked her head out the door, summoning Julian for dessert. Her eyes landed on his phone screen, and she saw Caleb. Her jaw dropped. She rushed over, asking who the handsome guy was. Only when she was face to face with Caleb's image did a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She offered a shy smile and a timid hello. Julian swore he had never seen his cousin act so demure. Caleb, momentarily surprised, politely returned the greeting. Mia turned her intense gaze on Julian, asking if Caleb was his classmate. Julian answered vaguely that he was, in a sense. He explained that Caleb was their high school classmate, Sarah's son, and that he had even visited their house years ago. The recognition dawned on Mia's face. Sarah was the woman Julian's father was about to marry. Julian ended the call to go eat. He walked inside, pulling his cousin along. But Mia was lost in thought. A few moments later, she slid next to Julian, her small bowl of pumpkin pie in hand. She smiled sweetly at him, calling him brother. A shiver went down Julian's spine. He told her to act normal. Mia pouted but then nudged him with her elbow, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. She casually brought up the boy from the video call, Caleb. She fired off a series of questions asking about his university, his height, his zodiac sign, and most importantly, his relationship status. Julian immediately understood her intentions. He looked at his cousin with a sense of wonder, marveling at how quickly kids grew up these days, already scouting for attractive partners at her age. His lips twitched, and he was about to assume the role of the responsible adult and warn her off, but he paused. A few seconds later, a mischievous grin spread across his face. He informed her that Caleb was already taken. Mia's face fell with disappointment as she asked if it was true. After a brief moment of gloom, she rallied, asking what his girlfriend was like and if she was beautiful. Julian held up his phone, using the black screen to check his own reflection. He replied that she was gorgeous. Mia walked away, dejected. Her sorrow was short-lived, however. A piece of fried chicken quickly restored her spirits. It was clear her crush was fleeting, easily overshadowed by a drumstick. Meanwhile, Julian sat there, a sense of smug satisfaction washing over him. It was definitely time to make their reconciliation official. Leaving Caleb out in the open felt far too risky with all the potential admirers lurking about. Julian stayed at his uncle's for 2 days before returning home on the 4th day of the holiday break. His mother was about to leave on a trip with his grandmother and younger sister, leaving him to his own devices. But before she left, she insisted on treating his father, David, and Sarah to a meal. Caleb, naturally, was invited. When Julian saw Caleb in the restaurant lobby, he bounded over like an overexcited puppy, wrapping his arms around Caleb's neck from behind. He whispered playfully, asking if the handsome man had missed him. The sudden weight made Caleb stumble forward, the pressure on his neck nearly choking him. After catching his breath, he looked back at Julian, replying that he had, but if Julian pulled any harder, he'd have to miss him from the afterlife. Julian swatted him, chiding him for making such grim jokes during the holidays. While the two young men were horsing around, Julian's mother, Wendy, was already chatting with Sarah. The meal was both a casual get-together and a celebration of David and Sarah's impending wedding. Wendy had even brought wedding gifts, a set of Le Creuset cookware and a delicate gold bracelet with 2 intertwined fish. Once they were seated in the private dining room, Wendy told Sarah quite frankly that she wouldn't be attending the wedding. She explained that while there were no hard feelings between them, her presence would undoubtedly attract unwanted stares and gossip, and she preferred not to be the subject of speculation. Over the years, whenever she came back to visit and pick up Julian, she would inevitably run into Sarah. Her son had received a great deal of care from Sarah, and the two women even spoke on the phone occasionally. They had become something like friends. Sarah nodded in understanding. She still felt a bit awkward about the situation, but Wendy's casual and open demeanor helped her relax. Their conversation flowed from family matters to wedding preparations, with David quietly refilling their tea. The atmosphere was surprisingly harmonious. The restaurant buzzed with activity. 2 servers attended to their private room, likely oblivious to the complex relationships seated at the table. Julian and Caleb remained in the background, focusing on their food. Halfway through the meal, Julian had had too much water. He tapped Caleb, saying he was heading to the restroom. Caleb, engrossed in a game on his phone with Julian's younger sister, Zoe, nodded without looking up. Julian strolled off by himself. After using the restroom, he stood at the sink washing his hands, examining his reflection from different angles in the mirror, wondering if he'd put on some holiday weight. As he was lost in thought, a surprised and pleasant female voice called out to him. She asked if he was Julian. Julian turned instinctively, a polite smile already forming on his face. But when he saw who it was, the smile froze, and a look of sheer panic replaced it. The world was indeed a small place. Standing next to him was the undisputed queen of their high school, the most popular girl from the class next door. The very person he had supposedly wronged by stealing her man. Chloe. Julian's brain short-circuited. He stared awkwardly at Chloe, at a loss for words. Normally talkative and easygoing, he found himself tongue-tied in her presence. Chloe had changed quite a bit since high school. She wore a white turtleneck under a tailored black coat, paired with loose white trousers. Her hair was casually tied back, giving her a look that was both chic and professional. With her sweet-looking face, she had been typecast as the cute, innocent type back when everyone wore the same school uniform. But now, after a few years, she exuded a cool, commanding presence as she smiled at him. She asked with a grin if he didn't recognize her, reintroducing herself as Chloe, his high school classmate from the class next door, who used to come by their classroom to see Caleb. Julian quickly shook his head, insisting he remembered her. He forced a smile, racking his brain for something to say. He recalled that they had spoken a few times in high school and that she had once given him some antiseptic when he scraped his knee during a track meet. He was so nervous he was practically stuttering. Despite being taller than her, he stood by the sink looking as timid as a startled quail. Chloe's smile widened. She dried her hands with a paper towel and commented on how he was still as adorable as he was in high school. She remembered how he used to trail after Caleb like a shadow, and how Caleb, in turn, was fiercely protective of him. She thought about it with a silent chuckle but kept the observation to herself. Instead, she pulled out her phone and suggested they exchange numbers, remarking on the coincidence of running into each other after all this time. She mentioned she had just returned from abroad and that they should hang out sometime. Julian's eyes widened. This felt inappropriate. He, Caleb's complicated and on-again off-again ex, and Chloe, Caleb's former admirer, hanging out together? The thought was bizarre. But Chloe's manner was so natural and her tone so warm and friendly that after a moment of internal debate, Julian dazedly handed over his phone. Chloe scanned his contact QR code. With a soft chime, they were connected. A jolt went through Julian. He was certain that Chloe had no idea about the real reason her confession to Caleb had been rejected back then. If she knew, she wouldn't be smiling at him so pleasantly. The thought made him swallow hard. Chloe, oblivious to Julian's inner turmoil, happily saved his contact information. As they walked out together, she was already scrolling through his social media feed. She lit up, exclaiming that she saw he liked going to live music shows. She said she was a fan too and suggested they go together next time. Julian, his face stiff, managed a non-committal nod. As they were making small talk and rounding a corner, Julian wasn't watching where he was going and walked straight into someone. The person was tall and had a solid jaw, which collided painfully with Julian's face. Wincing, he reflexively apologized without looking up. But when he lifted his head to check on the person he'd run into, he froze. It was Caleb, looking down at him with an annoyed expression. Caleb hadn't expected such a direct impact either. He rubbed his chin, suspecting a bruise was already forming. Julian was dumbfounded, asking what Caleb was doing there. Caleb raised an eyebrow, stating that he had come to find him. Julian had been gone for an unusually long time for a simple trip to the restroom, and the rest of the family had already settled the bill and were ready to leave. Julian mumbled an "oh," then quietly explained that he had run into Chloe in the restroom and they had been chatting. He glanced instinctively at Chloe, who was also looking at Caleb. It was a reunion with a former crush, but her expression was calm, even amused. Only then did Caleb seem to acknowledge Chloe's presence. He turned and gave her a quick, appraising look. He asked her what she was doing there, under the impression that she was spending the holidays abroad. Chloe had gone overseas for college after graduation and wasn't expected to be back this year. She crossed her arms, still smiling, and explained that she was also there for a meal. She had just finished a get-together with friends. She'd only been back for 2 days, a last-minute decision prompted by her parents' insistence. She added, with a slight dip in her smile, that they were already trying to set her up on dates, pushing all sorts of people on her. Caleb frowned at this. He remarked coldly that matchmaking was a foolish endeavor and questioned its effectiveness. Chloe didn't seem offended by his blunt criticism of her family. In fact, she nodded in agreement. Julian, however, shot a surprised look at the two of them. He pouted, a sour feeling rising in him. He thought to himself that Caleb was being awfully nosy. What business was it of his if her parents were setting her up? The trio started walking towards the entrance, as loitering by the restrooms was getting strange. Julian's ears were pricked, trying to catch every word of Caleb and Chloe's conversation. But their discussion was disappointingly mundane. Aside from some casual pleasantries, they talked about their studies. Chloe was planning to pursue a doctorate and was asking Caleb how many years of medical school he had left. It was all very professional, almost boring. By the time they reached the lobby, Julian's parents and Sarah were waiting. They looked surprised to see Julian and Caleb return with a young woman. Chloe, however, was perfectly composed. She greeted the adults politely, introducing herself as a high school classmate of both Caleb and Julian. The adults nodded in return. Sarah studied Chloe's face for a moment, and a flicker of recognition crossed her features. She remembered Chloe visiting their house in high school to see Caleb. Her expression warmed considerably. Chloe was surprised to be remembered from that single visit. She smiled and confirmed it was her. But a glance at her watch reminded her she had other plans, so she didn't linger. After a quick goodbye, she left, but not before waving to Julian and suggesting they hang out soon. Caleb heard this and turned a suspicious gaze on Julian, questioning what they had talked about that led to an invitation to hang out. He pressed, asking if they were really close enough to be making plans. Julian shook his head, explaining that they had just exchanged numbers and it was a casual suggestion. But Caleb continued to look at him with a skeptical eye, as if weighing the truth of his words. He told Julian to stay away from her, claiming she was far more cunning than Julian could handle. Julian huffed, offended by the implication that he was simple-minded. His mood soured and he felt the urge to argue. He retorted, asking what right Caleb had to dictate his friendships when he and Chloe seemed to be on such good terms. Why couldn't he be friends with her too? Caleb made a frustrated sound, starting to say something but then cutting himself off. Instead, he just squeezed Julian's cheek with a look of displeasure and opened the car door. They had arrived in David's SUV and were now heading back the same way. On the way, they first dropped Wendy off at Julian's grandmother's house. The adults had been discussing Wendy's upcoming travel plans, but the topic shifted to a relative's son who was getting married soon. Suddenly, Sarah laughed as if remembering something. She tapped Caleb, who was in the front passenger seat, and asked cheerfully if the girl they had just met was the one he was close to in high school. She then asked if they had dated. David's interest was piqued. Older parents always seemed to enjoy meddling in their children's love lives. He looked at Caleb expectantly, remarking that he didn't know Caleb had a girlfriend in high school and that the girl was quite attractive. He complimented Caleb on his good taste. Julian, who was driving, gripped the steering wheel tighter, his expression darkening. Caleb, who had been looking at his phone, frowned deeply at the question. He dismissed it as nonsense, stating firmly that he and Chloe had no romantic relationship whatsoever and were just friends. It was impossible. He added that he had been completely focused on his studies in high school, a fact his mother should know. Sarah playfully slapped his back, retorting that he was hardly a pure academic, recalling how he would play video games to unwind even during his senior year. She credited half of his success to his natural intelligence. Then, her tone softened as she returned to her gossip. She said that regardless of his high school dating life, he was 21 now and should consider dating. There were plenty of nice girls in college and from his high school. She assured him she wasn't old-fashioned. Caleb just gave a cold, dismissive chuckle and refused to engage further, showing no interest. Listening to the interrogation from the back, Julian had to fight the urge to roll his eyes. He fumed silently. What was wrong with these people? They were completely clueless, shipping the wrong pair. The real love interest was right here. He was Caleb's ex-boyfriend. After they got home, Julian was still in a foul mood. David and Sarah went out for a walk, leaving Julian and Caleb alone in the house. He sat on the couch, aggressively stabbing a spoon into a pint of taro-flavored ice cream. Caleb was next to him, engrossed in a medical textbook, usually completely absorbed in such situations. But after a while, the silence from Julian's side of the couch felt unusually heavy. He glanced over. Julian was pouting, the ice cream in his hands now a cratered mess. a look of deep grievance on his face. Caleb frowned, asking what was wrong and why he seemed upset. Took Julian a moment to realize Caleb was talking to him. He replied automatically that nothing was wrong. Caleb wasn't convinced and asked if he was sure. Julian let out an impatient sigh. He had to admit, since their breakup, Caleb's ability to read his emotions had improved dramatically. He insisted again that he was fine, just tired from a poor night's sleep. To prove his point, he grabbed the remote and switched the channel to a comedy show. Caleb watched him for a few seconds. Julian seemed genuinely engrossed in the TV, even letting out a couple of dopey laughs. Caleb raised an eyebrow, skeptical but willing to let it go, and returned to his book. The show did distract Julian for a bit. He chuckled as a celebrity on screen fell into a pool of mud. But soon, his smile faded, and his expression became blank again, his mind wandering. He was genuinely unhappy. The entire ride home from the restaurant, a heavy feeling had settled in his chest. To be fair, Chloe was a likable person, but the moment he saw her, his heart had sunk. He couldn't help but remember that summer morning confession, with Chloe and Caleb standing face to face, a picture-perfect couple amidst the scent of damp grass. And when Sarah had asked if she was Caleb's girlfriend, a dark wave of jealousy had threatened to consume him. Yet, he knew these were his own insecurities at play. Of the three people involved that day, he was the only one who wasn't composed, the only one whose mind was racing with anxious thoughts. Both Chloe and Caleb had been calm and casual, treating it as a simple chat between old acquaintances. Especially Chloe. She was truly someone who could move on. The way she looked at Caleb was the way one looks at a familiar friend, devoid of any lingering affection or regret. Thinking about it, Julian felt a twinge of admiration. He knew he could never be that nonchalant. But it also suggested that Chloe was really over Caleb. Completely. And Caleb was the same. Their first relationship had been more of an accident than anything else. Now, Caleb's determination to get back together could only mean one thing. He had made his choice. He wanted to be with Julian for the long haul. The two of them were, at most, just old friends. For him to keep dwelling on it seemed pointless. As Julian reasoned with himself, his mood gradually improved. The storm clouds on his face gave way to sunshine. He finished the last spoonful of ice cream, shifted his position on the couch, and magnanimously leaned against Caleb. Just moments before, a clear divide had existed between them, wide enough for another person. Now he had closed the gap. Caleb felt a weight on his shoulder. He looked down. From his vantage point, he could only see Julian's delicate eyelashes blinking. His eyes were wide, and for once, he was quiet and docile, resting on Caleb's shoulder like an affectionate cat. Caleb noticed the shift in Julian's mood. He closed his book and asked teasingly what he was doing. Julian, now sipping on a carton of milk, mumbled that he was just leaning on him and not bothering him, telling Caleb to continue reading. A corner of Caleb's mouth turned up. He murmured softly, asking why Julian was being so needy. His voice was flat, betraying none of the immense pleasure he felt inside. Julian didn't seem to mind. He just adjusted his position, cradling the milk carton and taking small sips. Having cleared his head, Julian was back to his cheerful self. That night, before going to bed, he slipped into Caleb's room and climbed into his bed. He decided it was time to repay Caleb for what he had been meaning to for a while. Huddled under the covers, Julian was still a little embarrassed. But he encouraged himself with the thought that it was like a debt. Once paid, it was easier to borrow again. Today's investment was for a better future return. After a 1,000-word internal pep talk, he took a deep breath and buried his head. Caleb let out a soft hiss. He looked at the mound in the blankets before him, where he could just make out the side of Julian's flushed face. Julian's technique, frankly, was not the best. At one point, Caleb feared for his own physical well-being. But while Julian lacked natural talent, he was a quick study. After a bit of fumbling, he found the right rhythm. Caleb's Adam's apple bobbed. He remained silent, refraining from any teasing remarks. It wasn't that he didn't want to, but he knew that any comment from him at this point might startle Julian into a state of spontaneous combustion. So he wisely kept quiet. He had to admit, though, that his soul felt like it was floating. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the fact that Julian was actively trying to please him that he found so incredibly stimulating. The person he had secretly desired since he was 15, the one he had longed to kiss and hold, was now entirely his. He had briefly flown away like a bird, but he had ultimately returned to his hand. After what felt like an eternity, Julian emerged from under the covers with a muffled groan. He looked like he had just run a marathon, his face slick with sweat, his lips and cheeks flushed a deep crimson. Caleb cupped his face, gently wiping away the moisture from the corner of his mouth. Julian truly felt like an overinflated balloon on the verge of popping. His eyes darted around, trying to form words but failing. He didn't need to say anything, though. Caleb leaned in and kissed him softly. Half an hour later, after washing up in the bathroom, they were lying in bed together. Julian was much calmer now than he had been earlier, when he looked ready to crawl into a hole and disappear. Caleb had insisted on staying in Julian's room, squeezing into the same bed. Julian, feeling cocky and a bit obnoxious, asked why he should be allowed. He sprawled out on the bed, declaring that Caleb's bed wasn't any softer than his and that he had gotten used to sleeping alone. He suggested Caleb could sleep at the foot of the bed. Caleb just scoffed, pulled him up, and gave him 3 firm swats on the rear. He quoted an old saying about spoiling someone with too much leniency, then unceremoniously lifted the covers and nudged Julian towards the edge of the bed, telling him to make room. He declared he would sleep wherever he wanted, with no room for argument. Julian rolled his eyes but complied, shifting over. They lay side by side, shoulder to shoulder. The lights were off, casting the room in a dim, intimate glow. They looked at each other for a moment before sharing another lingering, wet kiss. The next morning, Julian had completely forgotten about the Chloe situation. Their household was in a flurry of activity. The 9th was David and Sarah's wedding day. There were rehearsals to attend and final checks to be made at the reception hall. They were swamped. But perhaps, as Chloe had said, they were fated to meet. Despite having made no plans, Julian ran into her again. Well, ran into wasn't quite accurate. 2 days before the wedding, with most preparations complete, Julian took a break and went to a friend's bar for a drink. At one point, he stepped into the hallway to smoke, sitting on a step next to a large planter. He was partially hidden by the shadows of a potted tree. After a moment, he heard someone on the phone nearby. At first, he didn't recognize the voice. He just heard a woman's voice pleading with someone she called darling, begging them to stop fighting with her. She insisted she wasn't the one who wanted to go on a blind date and that she had never even met the person. Julian's interest was piqued. It sounded like a soap opera unfolding, and though he didn't know who was on the other end, they seemed incredibly jealous. His position was awkward. To leave, he would have to walk right past the woman. He decided to pretend he wasn't there. But after a few more sentences, the woman on the phone, as if wanting the world to hear, switched to speakerphone. The voice on the other end was also female. Julian raised an eyebrow, starting to feel uncomfortable listening in, as the conversation had shifted from a lover's quarrel to flirtatious banter. From his limited understanding, the woman next to him was in the process of placating her rather dramatic girlfriend. Honestly, it was quite entertaining. Julian rubbed his nose and stood up. Awkward or not, he couldn't keep eavesdropping. But just as he took a step, the woman hung up, blowing a kiss to her phone with a smile on her face. She turned in his direction. Their eyes met. Chloe was startled, taking a few seconds to register who it was. She called out his name, asking what he was doing there. Julian never would have imagined that the person next to him was Chloe. He stood there awkwardly, his toes curling in his shoes. He stammered that he was also there to see the show and had just stepped out for a break. He said he was about to leave and didn't realize she was there, not knowing she was the one on the other side of the planter. He was rambling, but Chloe put two and two together. She had been talking to her girlfriend, and Julian must have overheard something. Seeing his flustered expression, the look of someone who had stumbled upon a juicy secret and was now dying of embarrassment, she couldn't help but laugh. She told him not to be nervous, that it was no big deal. She smiled kindly and asked if he had heard her talking to her girlfriend. She assured him it was fine, as they hadn't discussed anything private. The word girlfriend rolled off her tongue with complete ease. Julian, however, stared at her, his eyes wide. The moment he had seen Chloe, he had dismissed his earlier theory about the eavesdropped conversation. He had thought maybe she was just talking to her sister or something. But now, Chloe herself had said the word girlfriend. He gasped, his face a mask of confusion. He blurted out, "How can you have a girlfriend? What about Caleb? Was their high school thing just a youthful crush? Or had Caleb's rejection been so traumatic that she had switched teams? Surely not. If so, the guilt would be immense." The thought made Julian's face turn pale. But Chloe was even more bewildered than he was. She asked why she couldn't have a girlfriend. Because Julian stammered, unable to articulate his thoughts. He couldn't just tell her that he knew she had confessed her feelings to Caleb. That would be humiliating for her. He had at least that much decency. He mumbled something about thinking she liked boys in high school. He recalled that their classmate, Zach, had asked her out, but she had turned him down, saying she already liked someone. The whole grade had speculated on who it was, and everyone assumed it was a boy. Oh, that, Chloe chuckled, clearly familiar with the high school rumor mill. She admitted that she did like someone back then, but being in high school, it wasn't easy to come out, so she had kept it vague to avoid drama. She looked at Julian, her expression still amused, and delivered a line that would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. "But I've always liked girls. Didn't Caleb ever mention that to you?" With a crash, Julian stumbled backward, knocking over the nearby planter. No, of course not. He hadn't heard a single word about it from Caleb. He was too stunned to even right the planter, staring at Chloe as if he'd seen a ghost. He asked weakly then, "What about Caleb? I thought you liked him. Are you bisexual? What?" Now it was Chloe's turn to be utterly confused. 10 minutes later, Julian and Chloe were sitting at a small round table outside the bar. Chloe listened with an expression of sheer disbelief as Julian frantically recounted the story, from high school to the summer after their freshman year of college. She stirred her cocktail with a small swizzle stick, feeling completely bewildered. She tried to summarize his account, saying that from what he understood from his classmates, she had confessed her feelings to Caleb right after Julian and Caleb had started dating. And he thought that she and Caleb had a strong connection in high school, a mutual but unspoken attraction, and that if it weren't for Julian, they would have ended up together. So he believed he had stolen Caleb from her? Julian nodded, his face etched with guilt. "Well, that's..." Chloe trailed off, shaking her head in amazement. She had never heard such a wild story in her life. Me and Caleb? The world would have to end before we'd ever be a couple. She thought about it and realized she was partly to blame. In high school, she was so consumed with academic competitions, piano practice, and chasing her first love that she paid little attention to the gossip around her. She had heard rumors that she was dating someone, but she never imagined it would be Caleb. That ice block, Julian's ears were burning. Even he, as dense as he could be, was starting to realize there had been a massive misunderstanding. He took a sip of his cocktail, his face flushing even more. He admitted that back in high school, he also thought they had a special connection. She was always coming to their classroom to find Caleb, and they would hang out on weekends. Caleb wasn't like that with any other girl, so he had assumed there was something between them. Chloe nodded in understanding. After a moment of self-reflection, she conceded that it wasn't entirely their fault for misunderstanding. She acknowledged that she and Caleb were closer than most, but it was because they were kindred spirits, united by a shared secret. Kindred spirits? Julian was lost. He looked at Chloe blankly, asking what she meant. Chloe looked back at him, amused. What else could it be? Can you really not guess? She glanced at her phone. The show inside was almost over. It was time for her to go. Her family knew about her orientation and, in their misguided attempt to control her, had imposed a curfew. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and looked at Julian, who was still reeling from the information overload. She smiled. That confession you mentioned. I remember now. It was a complete misunderstanding. She explained that she had just been dumped by her first love, who happened to be at the same university as Caleb. She had flown back from overseas to try and win her back, but it was no use. On her way back, she ran into Caleb and, overwhelmed with sadness, had poured her heart out to him. Julian's classmate must have overheard them talking but didn't catch the full context. At that time, fresh in college and feeling vulnerable, seeing an ally like Caleb had been a lifeline. She had wanted to drag him out for a drink, but Caleb had coldly refused, offering her only 10 minutes of his time to listen. She patted Julian's shoulder reassuringly. Even if it were the apocalypse, Caleb and I would never be a couple. I've always been into girls. And Caleb, he's had a boy he's been in love with since high school. We were just allies in the same boat. With that, Chloe gave Julian a Johnny wave, said goodbye, and left. She was as free-spirited as ever, a fleeting breeze that had briefly touched down before disappearing again, leaving Julian sitting there in a stunned silence. The show had ended, and people were starting to trickle out of the bar. They were still buzzing from the music, laughing and slinging their arms around each other, humming tunes. They ambled past Julian, the occasional clink of beer bottles echoing in the night. But Julian didn't look up. The winter wind was cold against his face, but he didn't move. His mind was consumed by Chloe's parting words and her knowing look. He thought back to the last high school reunion, when Caleb, from across the crowded room, had quietly admitted to having a crush in high school. If it wasn't Chloe, if it was a boy, then who could it be? Like someone in a trance, Julian let out a soft, internal gasp. Who had occupied most of Caleb's time in high school? Who had Caleb treated like a precious treasure? And who had he shared a fleeting, drunken first kiss with at a party? Julian felt like he was sleepwalking as he made his way home. The taxi dropped him off at the entrance to his street. He distractedly scanned the payment code, almost adding an extra zero. Thankfully, the driver was honest and pointed it out. After thanking him, Julian walked numbly to his front door. He stared at the familiar house, listening to the gentle sound of the water feature in the yard. He leaned against the wall, covering his face with his hands. Suddenly, he didn't want to go inside. He didn't know how he could face Caleb. In the taxi, the final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. He had frantically texted Chloe, begging her not to say anything to Caleb yet. A minute later, her reply came back. Sorry, it was too funny. I already sent him a screenshot. My bad, I was too quick. The moment Julian read those words, his heart turned colder than the winter wind. He discovered for the first time that the cool and confident Chloe was also a bit of a gossip. This is a disaster, Julian muttered. He looked up at the lit window of the upstairs bedroom. The thought of Caleb waiting for him in his room made him want to turn and run. Call him a coward, but he was more terrified now than he had been after failing a major exam in high school. He even had the wild thought of just getting a hotel room for the night. If he didn't have to see Caleb, everything would be fine. But he didn't dare. Not only was the next day his dad and Sarah's wedding, where he was expected to be a groomsman, but he knew Caleb would hunt him down at any hotel. After a moment of internal debate, Julian took a deep breath, summoned his courage, and pushed open the gate. The new smart lock beeped as he entered their shared birthday for the code. He poked his head in, looked around, and then tiptoed inside. He hadn't taken more than a few steps when a low voice came from the darkness behind him. Running from something? Finally decided to come home? Julian froze. He turned his head stiffly. Caleb was sitting at the stone table in the yard. He was dressed in black, a game piece held loosely in his hand. The yard lights were off, and only the pale moonlight illuminated him, making him look like a ghostly figure. He had been so quiet, and it was so dark, that Julian hadn't even noticed he was there. Caleb tossed the white game piece into a woven box. He had been waiting there for half an hour since seeing Chloe's text, passing the time by playing a game against himself, though his mind wasn't on it. He looked up at Julian. Julian looked like a kid caught sneaking home from a forbidden outing, his body tense, his eyes darting everywhere, looking for an escape that wasn't there. Realizing he was trapped, Julian mumbled his name. Caleb. Caleb gave a cold smile. So now he knew how to be polite. He leaned one hand on the table, his legs crossed, his posture perfect as he scrutinized Julian. So, I hear I'm in love with Chloe? He laughed, a humorless sound, as if he expected a flower to bloom on Julian's face. His voice, however, was deceptively calm. And we've been secretly in love since high school? She even confessed to me in college, but I turned her down for you? Julian winced. Caleb was hitting every sore spot. He started to explain, but then he realized he had nothing to say. What Caleb said was exactly what he had believed for over a year. He deflated instantly. He looked at Caleb like a kicked puppy. If he had a tail, it would be tucked firmly between his legs. He mumbled, I didn't know she liked girls. Caleb's head was throbbing. He stood up from the stone bench and walked slowly towards Julian. Julian was panicking, all thoughts of dignity gone, ready to bolt. But Caleb grabbed his shirt and pinned him against the wall. They were both tall and long-limbed, and their bodies and shadows merged into one. Julian was trapped under the eaves, his back against the cool white wall, though he couldn't feel the chill through his jacket. Caleb wasn't using much force, just enough to keep him from running. The position was charged with intimacy. One of Caleb's legs was pressed between his knees, their bodies fitting together like a mortise and tenon joint. If Julian were to tilt his head back slightly, he would be in a perfect position for a kiss. Julian's heart pounded. He glanced nervously towards the house. The living room light was on, casting a warm yellow glow on the window, which only made him more anxious. He tried to push Caleb away, but Caleb was immovable, a solid mountain of resolve. Caleb couldn't care less if their parents saw them. For a fleeting moment, he thought about just dragging Julian inside and coming out to them right then and there. It would certainly clarify things and make it harder for Julian to pull away again. He looked down, his gaze tracing over Julian's panicked eyes. Julian was so frustrating. His eyes were so innocent, so pitiful. His lip caught between his teeth. One look from him enough to make anyone's heart melt. It was infuriating. He asked Julian, his voice laced with ice, I'm in love with Chloe? How come I'm the last to know? What mutual affection? In high school, besides borrowing notes and making small talk, what did I ever do with her? Did I send her love letters? Did I take her on dates? What could have possibly made you think that? He was practically grinding his teeth as he spoke. He had spent the vast majority of his high school years looking after the little troublemaker in his arms. He barely had enough time to keep an eye on Julian, let alone anyone else. He was the one who organized Julian's study notes, corrected his exams, and took care of him for over a month when he broke his arm playing basketball. By Julian's logic, he and Julian should have been destined for each other since high school. Be reasonable, Caleb said. Chloe and I were on good terms, but we barely spoke once a week in high school, only when we needed something. If she were my girlfriend, she would have left me out of sheer frustration long ago. Julian had been looking guilty, but at this last remark, he glared defiantly at Caleb. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Am I wrong? You and Chloe didn't talk much, but you were even colder to everyone else. Besides me, Chloe was the person you interacted with the most. Julian grumbled. It wasn't just me who thought that. The whole grade was saying you two were a couple. You couldn't even tell the other girls in our class apart. But Chloe was the only one who could borrow your notes. Caleb scoffed. You yourself said, besides me. The number of words I spoke to Chloe in an entire semester doesn't even add up to what I say to you in a single day. By your logic, what does that make us? That was true. Julian was stumped. But a small part of him was still resentful. How was I supposed to know you liked guys? Julian muttered. I thought you were straight. You and Chloe looked so good together, you had so much in common. You were a much better match for her than for me. Caleb almost laughed out of sheer frustration. Then why didn't you ask me? I was your boyfriend. You had every right to confront me. You held on to that secret for so long, you're really something. You suspected your boyfriend's heart belonged to someone else. Shouldn't you have fought with me? You could have even started a physical fight, made me admit I was wrong. Aren't you usually so fierce, Julian? Julian thought, as if I would dare. In his 20-something years, he had always been confident and bold. He'd climbed walls, skipped school, gotten into fights. He'd never backed down from anything. But when it came to Caleb, he lacked that confidence. Love breeds anxiety. Love breeds fear. He was too deeply in love, and the relationship had started under a cloud of misunderstanding. They were in a long-distance relationship, and his boyfriend wasn't always the most affectionate, often preoccupied with his work. As time went on and the initial excitement of the relationship faded, suspicion and panic began to creep in. Even the most audacious personality could become timid. He had wanted to ask Caleb for clarification, but he was afraid of an answer he didn't want to hear. Julian's nose tingled, and he turned his face away. He knew he was being overly dramatic. It was his own insecurity, his lack of faith in Caleb. He had been a coward. But the small, painful moments that had led him to this point were so numerous and scattered throughout their long-distance relationship that he couldn't piece them together into a single, coherent reason. I'm sorry, I was wrong, he whispered to Caleb. Feeling it wasn't enough, he gently tugged on Caleb's shirt. I know I was wrong. Please don't. Ignore me. Caleb was taken aback. He stared at Julian's lowered eyelashes, the tip of his nose slightly pink. Julian wasn't crying, but his expression was one of undeniable sadness, even a hint of panic. You. Caleb felt a surge of his own panic. He gently lifted Julian's face, forcing him to meet his gaze. Julian was reluctant to look at him, but his eyes were indeed a little red, though not obviously so. Caleb frowned. His tone softened. What did I say? Why are you so scared? I'm not really trying to settle scores with you. Caleb sighed. I just think it's ridiculous. You broke up with me so decisively. I always thought you had grown to hate me, that you didn't like me anymore. But if you broke up with me over a misunderstanding, what kind of circle have we been running in? As Caleb spoke, his voice was filled with a sense of weary frustration. When Julian had broken up with him, he had said he was tired of it, that they weren't suited to be a couple, only friends. Caleb had believed him. He had agonized for months, suffering through countless sleepless nights, even drinking to the point of near alcohol poisoning, terrifying his roommates. But if it was all just a misunderstanding, then the past 6 months of distance, the heartache and confusion, were all just a cruel joke. Leaning against the wall, Julian unconsciously scratched at it, flaking off a bit of white paint. Perhaps he should just agree with Caleb, admit how absurd he had been, and promise it would never happen again. It was his fault, after all. He should apologize, and Caleb would forgive him. That would be the end of it. But as he looked into Caleb's eyes, so gentle and full of confused helplessness, a wave of indescribable sorrow washed over him. He remembered the white ceiling of a hotel room, the dead rose in Caleb's apartment, and standing outside Caleb's university. Bored and kicking at pebbles on the ground, only for Caleb's first words upon seeing him to be, "What are you doing here?" He took a shaky breath, his eyes stinging. He said, almost to himself, "I broke up with you because I didn't think you loved me. I thought you had never liked me at all." "What did you say?" Caleb was completely stunned. He repeated the words in disbelief, a look of pure confusion on his face for the first time. I didn't like you? That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. It's better than any comedy sketch. He shook his head, as if to clear it. If I didn't like you, why would I have been with you? Good question. Julian thought that over the past year, he had been asking himself the same thing. He wanted to believe that Caleb was with him out of love. But they were so often apart, and Caleb had so much on his mind. It felt like there was a veil between them. He was on one side, looking at Caleb on the other, seeing only a hazy, indistinct image. Sometimes he could feel a glimmer of Caleb's love, but at other times, it felt like nothing more than a reflection in the veil. Because you didn't really act like my boyfriend, Julian said, his voice hoarse. You were still like my best friend. You were good to me, you took care of me, but you weren't that intimate. Every time I came to see you, I was afraid I was bothering you. Caleb's frown deepened. When did I ever say you were a bother? Julian opened his mouth. He wanted to say, you never said it, but you also never managed to sit through a whole movie with me. But he couldn't get the words out. A sudden loud bang from outside the yard, like a brick falling, made them both jump. Julian instinctively grabbed Caleb's sleeve and looked towards the gate. Thankfully, it was still closed. Sarah and David hadn't come out. Caleb was startled too. He glanced back and then patted Julian reassuringly. It's nothing. Just a bird that knocked a loose brick off the wall. Julian's racing heart settled. But the interruption had shattered the charged atmosphere between them, and a heavy silence fell. They both realized this wasn't the right place or time for this conversation. Tomorrow was David and Sarah's wedding, an important day that couldn't be marred by any drama. A conversation between exes about their past was bound to get emotional, and they couldn't risk their parents overhearing. They might have to come clean to their parents about their relationship one day, but it couldn't be tonight or tomorrow. Leaning against the wall, Julian pursed his lips. He ran a frustrated hand through his hair and said to Caleb, My head is a mess right now. Caleb, even if you asked me to explain, I couldn't give you a clear answer. Tomorrow is our parents' wedding. Can we talk after it's over? Caleb looked at Julian intently. He understood his concerns. And they did need to have a proper conversation. Since returning from college, neither of them had touched the topic of their breakup. It was a taboo, an elephant in the room that they both saw but dared not address. But the incident with Chloe had made him realize that there were probably many misunderstandings between them. Okay, Caleb said, but after the wedding, whatever I ask, you have to answer. No more secrets. Julian nodded distractedly. Okay. They stood outside for a while longer, composing themselves until they were sure they looked normal. Then, one after the other, they went inside. The house was filled with a festive atmosphere in preparation for the wedding. Red decorations adorned the windows and doors, and bowls of candy and dried dates were set out on the tables. Sarah was trying on her dress for the next day. It was going to be a simple ceremony, mainly a celebratory dinner with friends and family. She had chosen a traditional Chinese-style gown in a soft apricot color, embroidered with gold and red patterns. It suited her perfectly, making her look radiant. When she saw Julian and Caleb, she twirled in front of them, asking uncertainly if it fit well. It had been a little tight in the waist, so she'd had it altered. Julian told her sincerely that she looked beautiful. Caleb nodded in agreement. They didn't stay downstairs for long. They went up to their rooms together. At the doors to their respective rooms, Julian hesitated, looking at Caleb as if he wanted to say something. Caleb stopped and waited. I'm sorry, Caleb, for misunderstanding you for so long, Julian said, referring to the Chloe situation. The moment he realized Caleb didn't have feelings for Chloe, he had felt a surge of secret joy, a feeling that Caleb was one step closer to him. But that joy was quickly replaced by a profound sadness for his own foolish assumptions. Caleb watched him in silence, then slowly reached out and pulled Julian into a hug. You never need to apologize to me. For anything. Julian felt his nose tingle again. He looked up at Caleb. Caleb was often cold and serious, but he could also be incredibly gentle. On impulse, he stood on his toes and gave Caleb a quick peck on the cheek. "Good night," he said. He darted away, opening his bedroom door and slipping inside before Caleb could react. Leaning against the wall, Caleb chuckled to himself. But his smile quickly faded. The hallway chandelier swayed gently, its pale green stained glass casting a faint, ethereal light that illuminated his face in shifting patterns of light and shadow. He thought back to the yard, to Julian's panicked and guilty expression, like a child caught doing something wrong. He couldn't believe Julian thought he didn't love him, but he couldn't blame Julian for it. He remembered Chloe's sarcastic words. "You call this a relationship? You see each other less than I do, and I'm in a cross-continental relationship. Long distance is hard enough, and you don't even make time for him. All you do is work. Yes, you're building a future, but your present is falling apart. Who do you think you'll have a future with?" Chloe's words were born from her own painful experience of a long-distance relationship that had ended in a breakup. Caleb rubbed the bridge of his nose, a headache brewing. He glanced at Julian's closed door before finally turning and entering his own room. The night passed. The next morning, the wedding car departed from their house. They had skipped the more complicated traditional ceremonies, so their plan was simple. Arrive at the hotel for the reception before noon. Julian, having slept poorly, was yawning in the back seat. David looked back at him and teased, "Son, it's my wedding. Are you really that excited? Look at your eyes. Did you not sleep at all?" Julian shot him a look, not bothering to reply. David continued cheerfully, "Don't get too worked up. Save it for your own wedding." Julian scoffed internally. He thought, "If you saw who the other groom was at my wedding, you'd need an oxygen tank." He secretly glanced at Caleb, who was looking back at him. The eye contact only made Julian more flustered. Back in his room last night, he had been filled with regret, burying his face in his pillow and wanting to bang his head against the wall. He was such an idiot. How could he have messed things up again? He had intended to properly apologize to Caleb for the massive misunderstanding, which was entirely his fault. He had planned to make it up to him. But somehow, in the course of the conversation, he had ended up being the one feeling wronged. Even now, thinking about it, he sighed. He was probably the most overly dramatic person in the world. His 15-year-old cousin was more resilient. If there was a hole in the car, he would have crawled into it. Fortunately, Caleb was acting completely normal, treating him the same as always. That morning, during breakfast, Caleb had, in full view of their parents, brazenly popped a piece of candied date into his mouth. Julian licked his lips, the sweet taste still lingering. He wondered why Caleb had done that. The gesture was a tradition meant to wish for a new son soon. He couldn't exactly get pregnant. Once they arrived at the hotel, Julian had no more time for idle thoughts. As the hosts of the wedding feast, he and Caleb, the two adult sons, were responsible for greeting guests, seating them, and managing the gift registry. For 2 solid hours, Julian barely had a moment to sit down, though if asked what exactly he was busy with, he couldn't have said. It wasn't until the reception officially began and the MC took the stage that he was finally able to wipe the sweat from his brow and take a seat at the main table with Caleb, giving them a front-row view of their parents. Though there was a professional photographer, he still took out his phone and aimed it at the couple on stage. David and Sarah were exchanging vows. They were middle-aged, both 47, but as they stood on the stage, Julian noticed that his father's eyes were glistening. Others might not have seen it, but he, their son, saw it immediately. His dad was nervous, his hand trembling slightly as he placed the ring on Sarah's finger. Watching them, Julian felt a strange sense of melancholy. He wondered what his father had been feeling 20-something years ago when he put a ring on his mother's finger. He had seen his parents' wedding photos. They were ordinary, dressed in the popular styles of the time, smiling as they linked arms, not overly intimate but not distant either. They were so young then, unaware that their marriage would end in separation, that it might take half a lifetime to find true love. They had smiled at the camera, a little awkwardly but openly. And now, at nearly 50, his father and Sarah were together. He was confident that this time, they would grow old together. The bride and groom had exchanged rings. Julian joined in the applause, glancing at Caleb beside him. Amidst the cheerful noise of the reception, he whispered, not knowing if Caleb could even hear him, "Well, now you're really my brother." Their parents were married, making them brothers by law, adding another layer of complexity, another chain, to the tumultuous, secret emotions between them. No matter how far they went, it felt like they were tied together by an invisible string, always to be pulled back. He didn't know if it was a blessing or a curse. He smiled and added softly, "If Dad knew we were together, he'd call it a family tragedy." His voice was so low he didn't expect Caleb to hear. In that moment, a montage of memories flashed before his eyes. Walking home from high school with his arm around Caleb's shoulders, sitting on a rooftop drinking with Caleb after graduation. Caleb using his scholarship money to buy him a new sound system during their first winter break from college, and Sarah sitting on a hospital bed, smiling weakly, saying she wondered when she would see him and Caleb married with children. Julian smiled and took a sip of red wine. The MC was tossing gift boxes and candy from the stage. A round red candy landed in front of him. He reached for it, his hand colliding with Caleb's. Their hands met, and the round candy rolled a few times before settling in the space where their palms joined. Julian looked up, his eyes meeting Caleb's. Above the clinking glasses and laughter, he heard Caleb say, "Family tragedy or not, perfect match or not, no matter what we are to each other, brothers, lovers, we will never be apart in this life." After the wedding reception ended and the guests had departed, only the four of them remained. Balloons and confetti littered the floor, and the rose arch at the entrance was still vibrant. Julian thought it was a shame to let it go to waste, so he plucked a rose from the arch and pinned it to Caleb's lapel. "Looks good," he commented. The four of them drove home. It had been a long day, and everyone was exhausted. David and Sarah, the newlyweds, were too tired to revel in their new marital bliss and yawned as they said goodnight to their sons. David reminded them to get to bed early, as they were heading out on vacation the next day. Caleb and Julian nodded vaguely. But late that night, when the house was bathed in moonlight, neither of them went to their rooms. They went up to the rooftop terrace. The terrace had been built when Julian was in middle school. The house had been renovated a few years ago, but the terrace had been left untouched. It being winter, most of the plants had been moved indoors, leaving only a few hardy evergreens, a white railing, narrow wooden floorboards, and a couple of scattered sofas. An overhang provided shade and shelter from the rain, but not the moonlight. In the spring and summer, Julian and Caleb had often sat there doing their homework together. But they hadn't spent much time there since starting college. Now, they were sitting there again, still dressed in their wedding attire. Julian held a bottle of citrus fruit tea that Caleb had just made downstairs to help with the cold and the alcohol. He had drunk quite a bit at the reception. At 21, tall and handsome, and with a known tolerance for alcohol, the older relatives no longer treated him like a child, insisting he drink with them instead of hiding behind juice. He hadn't refused, and now he was feeling a little dizzy. He looked at a red decorative character for double happiness stuck to the railing opposite him. His dad, in his giddy newlywed state, had even decorated the terrace. Looking at the character, Julian chuckled for a moment, then felt a wave of sadness. He said to Caleb, "We might never be able to openly display one of these in our lifetime. First marriage, second, third. It seemed anyone could as long as the couple was happy. No one would object. But he and Caleb, childhood friends turned teenage lovers, devoted to each other, would at best be able to get a marriage certificate overseas that only they knew about." Julian knew what Caleb wanted to talk about, but he was probably a little drunk, and his thoughts drifted. "Do you remember last year when your mom had surgery?" he asked. It was for her gallbladder, not a major operation, but it had scared them all. "But you probably don't know that Sarah was scared too." Caleb raised an eyebrow. He truly didn't know. Sarah had been calm and composed in front of him, even comforting him. She seemed confident throughout the whole ordeal. Julian smiled faintly. She only told me after the surgery. You had to go back to school, and my dad had work, so I was the only one who could get time off to stay with her at the hospital. When it was just the two of us, she confessed that she was terrified when she went into the operating room. She was afraid that if something happened to him, she wouldn't get to see him get married and have children, to see him settled and with someone to rely on. She wouldn't be able to rest in peace. Those were Sarah's exact words. She wasn't aware of the secret between Julian and her son. She was simply a mother, expressing her post-surgery relief and anxieties to Julian. In front of Caleb, she had to be strong for her son's sake. But with Julian, a boy she had known for over a decade, she could let her guard down. Julian had been peeling an apple by her bedside when she said it. The knife had slipped and cut his finger. Now, looking at Caleb, he could almost feel the sting in his fingertip again. It wasn't a sharp pain, but a dull, lingering ache. He said to Caleb, "For a long time, I really thought you didn't like me that much. I thought that because we had known each other for so long, and you cared about me a lot, and we happened to sleep together, you felt you had to be responsible for me. I even thought maybe I should just go along with it. It's not like I forced you. Not every couple in the world is perfectly in sync. Whether you felt responsible or actually liked me, as long as you were with me, it was fine. But after hearing what your mom said that day, I felt so ashamed of myself for thinking that way. If you really didn't like me but were tied to me out of a sense of duty, how would that be any different from my parents' marriage? It would just fall apart eventually. Besides, I always felt that you were destined for great things, to live a life that everyone would envy." Caleb listened in silence. He hadn't known any of this. He saw the moisture in Julian's eyes, yet Julian was smiling at him, a heart-wrenching, pitiful smile. He reached out and gently wiped the corner of Julian's eye. "But I am living a life that everyone envies," he said. "Not everyone gets the chance to be loved by the person they love." The rose Julian had pinned to his chest was still intact. As he leaned in to kiss Julian, the flower was crushed between them, releasing a subtle, sweet fragrance that floated in the winter night air. He tasted citrus and honey on Julian's lips. Caleb looked at Julian and said softly, "I don't understand why you would think I don't like you. Julian, I can tell you with absolute certainty, from the time I was 15 until now, I have always loved you." This was his first love. On a summer afternoon when he was 15, sunlight filtered through the leaves of a tree, dappling Julian's sleeping face. He had reached out to block the light, then, on an impulse, had leaned down, overcome with the desire to kiss Julian's soft cheek. From that day on, it had been nearly 7 years since he had started loving Julian in secret. If Caleb hadn't said that, Julian might have been able to hold back his tears. But now they streamed down his face. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Julian asked, his voice choked with emotion. "Why did you never say you loved me?" Could he point to one single, dramatic event that led to their breakup? At least Julian couldn't. He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment the thought of breaking up had first crossed his mind. He only knew that it had grown out of the countless small moments of insecurity during their year of long distance, gradually eroding his confidence. Julian sniffled, feeling incredibly wronged. "Do you remember, in the year we were together besides winter break, how many times did we see each other?" 3 times. "And one of those was because my band had a gig near your university. I asked you to come, but you only stayed for 1 night and left the next day. Whenever I called you, you were always busy, either with your part-time job in the lab or in class. I knew you were busy, so I offered to come see you, but you weren't happy about it. You told me not to come, that you had no time for me and that it would just make me miss my own classes. But who in a relationship doesn't want to see their partner? Who isn't happy to be with the person they like? But you didn't even want to see me. You didn't want to see me." Julian's last words were barely a whisper. He looked at Caleb with tear-filled eyes, surprised by the sheer volume of his own tears. He wasn't a crybaby. As a kid, he had fallen down a flight of stairs and split his head open, yet he was joking with the nurses at the hospital. But with Caleb, it seemed he had an endless supply of grievances. Anyone could treat him badly, except Caleb. Every time I came to see you, I was so happy, but I felt like you weren't, he said. And you were always so tired. I would lie next to you and listen to you talk to people, using all this professional jargon I didn't understand. You're going to be a doctor, you started a consulting business with someone, you published academic papers, but I don't understand any of it. I like playing gigs with my band, hanging out with friends, going surfing and hiking. You don't seem to like any of that. Sometimes I thought maybe a more cultured girl like Chloe would be a better match for you. Maybe you would have more to talk about with her. He truly believed that. In his eyes, Caleb was perfect in every way. He had grown up watching Caleb excel at everything. Before he had ever considered spending his life with Caleb, he used to wonder what kind of goddess would be worthy of him, feeling that no one was good enough. So when problems arose between them, his first instinct was to blame himself. It was his fault, not Caleb's. Caleb had been listening quietly. At this, he couldn't help but frown and retort loudly, "I have never thought that." He looked at Julian intently. He was starting to understand the root of the problem. His own assumptions had been about 70 to 80% correct. He and Julian were indeed different. One was emotional and followed his heart, while the other was rational and planned everything meticulously. They weren't alike, but no one could say they weren't right for each other. Caleb said, "I didn't want you to come over all the time because I overestimated myself. I had piled up work, studies, and lab experiments. If you came, not only would I have no time to spend with you, but it would also be a waste of your time. You know me, I was nagging you about your studies back in high school. In college, I still wanted to manage you. I was always acting like a parent, thinking I knew what was best for you. You're right, I never adjusted my role. The truth is, I wanted to see you every day. I would pass by the flower shop downstairs and think, if you were here, I'd buy you a bouquet of sunflowers. I wished you lived in my apartment, waiting for me to come home every day. We could go for walks, I could cook you dinner, we could get a puppy or a kitten. But then I would think, this is just temporary, I just have to endure it for a little longer. But I could never really endure it. How could he not want Julian by his side? He was constantly thinking about him. But he felt he had to be the responsible one. Weighing the pros and cons, he always concluded that it wasn't worth it for Julian to travel for hours for what might be less than an hour of time together. And he really was incredibly busy back then. So busy that he didn't even have time to pick Julian up from the train station. He could see why Julian would think that having him as a boyfriend was no different from not having one at all. He told Julian, "It's not that I don't like you playing in a band and touring. I'm just jealous." Julian was stunned. He looked up at Caleb, confused. Caleb lowered his eyes and gave a self-deprecating smile. "I've always been jealous. Jealous of the people around you," he said. "The ones who are with you at your gigs, the ones who go surfing and hiking with you. The ones who go out for late-night food and drinks with you. And where was I? In the lab, in the library, at my internship. Anywhere but by your side. So I didn't want to hear about it. I pretended I wasn't interested because I was so consumed by my own dark feelings that I couldn't bear to hear the names of anyone who was close to you." He was never as perfect as Julian imagined. He was capable of darkness, jealousy, and resentment. He had all the same emotions and desires as anyone else. But all of them revolved around one person, Julian. Julian was dumbfounded. He blinked at Caleb, his lips slightly parted, tears clinging to his lashes, making them look messy and clumped together. He had never heard Caleb say any of this. When they were together, Caleb had always seemed calm and composed, a perfect gentleman. Whether it was the morning after their drunken night together, when Caleb sat calmly on the edge of the bed and asked if he wanted to give it a try, or when they broke up, and Caleb just frowned and told him to calm down and not be irrational. He had almost never seen Caleb lose control, let alone feel jealous. It was only in the last 2 months, since their breakup, living together as brothers under the same roof. That he had started to see glimpses of Caleb's emotional vulnerability, of him losing his composure over him. This had once led him to believe he was in some kind of romantic drama, where Caleb didn't appreciate him when he had him and only realized his deep-seated love after he had lost him. But now, Caleb was telling him he had never stopped loving him. That in the quiet of the night, he had also been tormented by jealousy over Julian's casual remarks. How was that possible? Julian looked at Caleb, bewildered, as if seeing him for the first time. He sized him up from head to toe. What's there to be jealous of? My bandmates are just my buddies, and everyone at school is just friends and classmates. You think everyone is like you, attracting admirers everywhere you go? Caleb had to laugh. Me, attracting admirers? He retorted. Since high school, you're the one who's received more love letters. There was Jessica, Ava, and Chloe from our class, Olivia from the class next door, and even girls from the other high schools. And what about that guy from the soccer team, Leo, and that senior, Matt? As Caleb listed the names, Julian's expression shifted from confusion to guilt, and finally to shock. Wait, the girls are one thing, but Leo and Matt? They're guys, Julian said, quickly defending his classmate's honor. Don't make things up. You think being gay is that common? Caleb looked at him dismissively. What would you know? He remembered the two of them, and a shadow crossed his face. One was a teammate Julian was always roughhousing with after practice, and the other was a senior who had mentored him in the broadcasting club. Though they had long lost touch, they had been quite close to Julian in high school. He could tell that Julian had almost forgotten about them until he brought them up. Julian was like the sun, warm and bright, effortlessly attracting others into his orbit. Friends came and went in waves, and before he had time to feel sad about their departure, new people would fill the void. In the end, the only constant, the only rock in Julian's life, was him. Caleb wasn't sure if he should be happy about that. He lowered his gaze, his tone softening. Leo admitted to me that he liked you, and Matt got a boyfriend later. Both of them had designs on you back then. You were the only one who didn't see it. He glanced at Julian, loosening his tie. Even on a cool winter night, the memory of it made him feel agitated. Julian was silent, as if too shocked to speak. But his eyes, shimmering in the moonlight, were studying Caleb with a look of disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom that Caleb could be so petty. Caleb gave a self-deprecating laugh. He knew it was pointless. It was all in the past, and Julian didn't even remember it. Yet here he was, still holding on to it. He stared at the milky white moonlight on the ground, as if giving up, and said in a low voice, "That's why I was always checking up on you later. I was always afraid that if I wasn't paying attention, someone would snatch you away. But I'm not the type to express my jealousy directly. All I knew how to do was lecture you about not slacking off. You probably just thought I was annoying." Julian pursed his lips. They had argued about this many times, but he had always thought it was because Caleb didn't support his passion, that Caleb thought he wasn't ambitious enough. But it turned out it was jealousy. "You're really something," Julian said, not knowing what else to say. The amount of new information tonight was overwhelming. His brain felt like it was short-circuiting. After a long pause, he finally managed to find a word. Complicated. He curled up on the arm of the sofa, looking up at Caleb. For the wedding, Caleb was dressed like a prince, his hair perfectly styled, his suit impeccable. Every line of his attire screamed handsome and elegant. When he stood in the reception hall, even just casually talking to someone, he looked like a figure from a painting. But now, under the moon and stars, Caleb was leaning against the sofa, a few strands of hair falling across his forehead. One leg was propped up on the chair, his hand resting on his knee, a hint of frustration in his expression. He looked less like a prince and more like a strikingly handsome but very real person. For some reason, Julian felt a flicker of happiness. A smile tugged at his lips, and he curled himself into a tighter ball. He rested his cheek on his knee, like a shy little shrimp, and asked in a soft, mumbled voice, Do you really care about me that much? Caleb ran a frustrated hand through his hair. He did have a complicated and stubborn side. He preferred to keep his feelings buried deep, never to see the light of day. But tonight, he had intended to interrogate Julian about the breakup, and instead, he was the one being dissected. All his hidden emotions were laid bare under the moonlight, like an open book, making him feel exposed and uncomfortable. But when he met Julian's expectant gaze, he couldn't bring himself to hide anymore. He said, "I care so much it's killing me." Julian couldn't help but let out a snort of laughter. Caleb's face was tense for a few seconds, but then, as if infected by Julian's laughter, he smiled too. He reached over and pulled Julian from the other end of the sofa into his arms. They huddled together, like two animals seeking warmth from each other. It was almost 2 in the morning, but neither of them wanted to leave the terrace. The fruit tea in the glass bottle was cold, but the scent of apples still lingered in the air. The red double happiness character on the wall shimmered in the moonlight. Julian's cheeks were flushed from Caleb's kisses. He was looking at Caleb's phone. Caleb had offered it to him, saying he wanted to be completely open with him. "Whoa," Julian said, sounding like he'd never seen so much money in his life. Caleb had several bank accounts, and all of them had a lot of zeros. He did a quick count and was filled with a newfound respect for Caleb. It was shocking. While he was still getting an allowance from his dad, Caleb already had enough for a down payment on a house. Caleb said nonchalantly, "This is all my savings. It's my marriage fund, I guess." Julian's head snapped up. Caleb looked a little uncomfortable. He was used to working quietly behind the scenes, showing off like this was new to him. He explained, "The reason I was so busy in college, juggling studies and part-time jobs, was because I wanted to be financially independent as soon as possible." He paused, a hint of superstition in his voice, reluctant to say the next words. But he had to, because he couldn't guarantee it wouldn't happen one day. "In case our parents ever find out about us," he said, "and your dad and my mom kick us out, I need to be able to support you." Caleb had been planning this since high school. Not that he was sure Julian would ever like him back then, but he allowed himself to daydream. He thought, what if Julian has a change of heart one day? He couldn't let his spoiled little troublemaker suffer. All the comforts David had provided for Julian couldn't just disappear if Julian chose to be with him. With that in mind, the workaholic in him found even more motivation. He never felt tired. But in his quest to save up for his future with his love, he had almost lost him. Julian felt like he was listening to a fairy tale. He stared at Caleb, his emotions on a roller coaster. He heard Caleb apologize. "I'm sorry, I should have told you sooner. I shouldn't have kept it from you for so long. But I didn't say anything because I didn't want to pressure you." Julian thought, "You're right, I feel a lot of pressure right now. How is Caleb so good at making money?" He was already frantically calculating his own bank balance. It was a disaster. Besides 2 guitars and a few $1,000s from part-time gigs, he had no real assets. He was pursuing music, wanted to release an album, and loved to travel. He had very few ways of making money, but he was an expert at spending it. The thought filled him with dread. He felt like Caleb had made a terrible choice in picking him. But Caleb seemed to read his mind. Julian's eyes were darting around, his thoughts written all over his face. Caleb let out the first genuine smile of the night. He reached out and squeezed Julian's cheek, just like he used to in high school. "You don't have to do anything. You're perfect just the way you are," Caleb said. "Having you by my side is what gives my life meaning. That's a grand enough purpose." There wasn't much to work with on the terrace. Caleb looked around and his eyes landed on the single rose on the windowsill. The one Julian had plucked from the arch and pinned to his lapel. He took the rose and pinned it to Julian's shirt. Then he cupped Julian's face and gave him a gentle kiss. "Get back together with me, Julian," he said. "I'll be good to you for the rest of our lives." Julian finally broke down, crying his eyes out. Tears blurred his vision. His shining treasure, his brother, his childhood friend, his Caleb. The person who had been a part of all his youthful memories, who pulled at every one of his heartstrings, was promising him a lifetime. Okay, he sobbed, agreeing. At 3 a.m, Caleb and Julian finally had to go back downstairs. The family was leaving for a vacation to the neighboring state the next day. They couldn't very well spend the night on the terrace. It was only a short walk down, and their rooms were right next to each other. But Julian lingered by his door, reluctant to go in. Caleb's hair was messy from the damp air on the terrace, a few strands falling over his eyes. He stood by the door, his suit jacket draped over his arm, looking at Julian with a gentle expression. Julian felt a strange tingle. He looked at his newly reinstated boyfriend and made a shameless suggestion. "How about one more kiss before we sleep?" Caleb laughed and readily agreed. They hid behind the door, kissing until they were dizzy. Julian pressed himself against Caleb like an overeager puppy, nuzzling him without any technique. Caleb was getting worked up, but with their parents just downstairs, he didn't dare do anything more. He just held Julian's waist tightly, pinning him against the door. They were both young and full of passion, having just resolved a long-standing misunderstanding. They wanted nothing more than to melt into each other. After a long time, they finally broke apart, panting. Julian leaned weakly against the door, his eyes hazy, his chest rising and falling. He smiled at Caleb. "Do you remember? We used to sneak kisses in my room all the time. Just last winter break." Of course, Caleb remembered. Relatives were visiting downstairs, and they could hear their laughter and conversation through the thin door. Little kids were running around, and someone could have come up to their room at any moment. He, who was always so composed, had been bewitched, throwing caution and decency to the wind to be with Julian. It was the same now. He knew he should let Julian go to bed. But Julian was leaning against him in just a white shirt, the corners of his eyes slightly red. He looked like a ripe, juicy peach, ready to be picked. One look at Julian, and the desire in him raged like a wildfire. Caleb buried his face in Julian's shoulder, his voice lazy. "We really need to get our own place. Otherwise, every time we get close, it feels like we're having an affair." Julian muffled a laugh, but his smile faded a little, and he teased Caleb, "Our own place? You should first think about how to explain this to our parents before we move out. With our relationship, coming out would probably get our legs broken, right?" Sarah was gentle and would never resort to violence. His dad, on the other hand, was a different story. But as soon as he said it, he regretted it. This was such a perfect, romantic moment. Why did he have to bring that up? Caleb just held him tighter. "Let them break my legs then," Caleb said softly. He thought if that day ever came, he deserved it. He had stolen their precious son. A beating would be getting off easy. "If anything happens, I'll take the fall. You just run." They lingered for another half an hour before Julian reluctantly opened his door and let Caleb go, like a mythical creature in a cave bidding a sad farewell to a passing traveler. That night, Julian only slept for 4 hours, but he woke up feeling energized. They were driving to the neighboring state capital, Willow Creek, where David had booked a villa at a scenic resort. It was a family vacation and also a mini honeymoon for him and Sarah. As David drove, he said to Julian, "I actually wanted to take your stepmom to New Zealand for our honeymoon. But she said it was too far to travel during the holidays, so we're just staying close by. But maybe you and Caleb can go in the future." He was still wistful about his New Zealand plan. Sarah, sitting next to him, smiled gently. "You have a lot of work to do at the company at the beginning of the year," she said softly. "We can go later. When Caleb and Julian graduate, we can all go on a trip together as a family." "That's true," David cheered up. "That would be very memorable." Julian wasn't listening to his dad. He was in the back seat, an arm draped over him, leaning on Caleb's shoulder, pretending to be asleep. But under the jacket, his pinky finger was hooked around Caleb's. Every so often, he would gently scratch Caleb's palm, earning him a glance from Caleb that was tinged with agitation. Julian looked at Caleb's profile, not only not stopping but feeling rather smug. But his smugness was short-lived. He gave his dad a look that was almost resentful. He actually liked family vacations. But at that moment, he had the unfilial thought that while his dad was on his honeymoon, he wished he could have some time alone with his boyfriend, especially right after getting back together. He didn't want to be under his parents' noses for a single second. The thought made him sigh. But soon, he discovered that his secret prayer had been answered by some benevolent deity. An hour later, they arrived at their destination, a resort on the outskirts of Willow Creek. After parking the car, David went to check in. He had booked a 4-bedroom villa, but the receptionist, after checking the reservation, informed him that he had a honeymoon suite in the A-wing and a top-floor executive suite in the C-wing. "That can't be right," David said, confused, looking at Caleb. "We booked a family villa." He hadn't been involved in the booking process, only the payment. Because Caleb was friends with the resort owner's son, he had left the arrangements to him, and they had even gotten a discount. Caleb, his face a mask of innocence, pretended to check the reservation. "My apologies, sir. I see now that I made a mistake." He offered a sincere apology. "It's peak season here, and there are no other rooms available. These two were specially held for us by my friend. We can't change it. How about this? The 4 of us can stay separately. Julian and I were planning to do our own thing anyway. We won't disturb you at night. We're all in the same resort, so it's not like we can't find each other." David thought about it and agreed. He turned to Sarah. "What do you think? Should we stay together or separately?" Sarah smiled. "This is fine. It doesn't matter where we stay. The boys will have more freedom on their own." But she gave her son a curious look. A mother knows her son, and Caleb was not the type to make such a basic mistake. It seemed intentional. Caleb pretended not to notice his mother's scrutinizing gaze. He smiled and handed his and Julian's IDs to the receptionist. "Could you please check us in?" Julian followed Caleb to the C-wing. Their room was on the 11th floor. In the lobby, he had put on a show for his dad and Sarah, pretending to be sad about being separated, as if he cherished every moment of their family time. His dad was touched and had even taken out his phone, saying, "Well, maybe I can look for another place. Can we cancel this one?" Julian immediately dropped the act. No, my brother and I will be fine on our own. Our travel plans are different from you old folks anyway. We can just message each other if we need anything. You should take my stepmom out, buy her some gifts. We're heading off." He grabbed his suitcase, pulled Caleb along, and made a quick escape. David was left speechless. He put his phone away resentfully and grumbled to Sarah, "That little brat. He only cares about his brother. What an act." Once they reached the top-floor executive suite, Julian threw his suitcase down and let out a wow. Caleb had specifically booked an ocean view room. Even though it was winter, Willow Creek was much warmer than their hometown. Felt more like autumn outside. The sun sparkled on the surface of the ocean. Though it was the top floor, it was only 10 stories high. Julian leaned out the window and felt like he could almost touch the water. But that wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was that this room had one king-sized bed. Julian turned slowly. A large bed was placed squarely in the center of the room. There was a sofa by the bed, but it was clearly not suitable for a grown man to sleep on. The intention was as clear as day. Julian couldn't help but remember the last time he and Caleb were stranded in a hotel room because of a snowstorm. That was also a top-floor room. He had been fighting with Caleb then, finding fault with everything he did, bombarding him with complaints, and then Caleb had pinned him down and had his way with him. It was brutal, utterly savage. But thinking back on it now, the arguments and sadness, Caleb's dominance and ferocity, had all faded like smoke, leaving only a rosy, romantic haze. Julian leaned against the glass window, drinking a bottle of water, watching Caleb meticulously hang their jackets from the suitcase. His gaze wandered down Caleb's body, his imagination running wild. His expression was a mixture of dreamy and lecherous. Tonight, it would be just the two of them. With the lights off, the sparkling ocean outside, and the stars within reach, the night was too perfect to not do something a little naughty. It would be a disservice to Caleb's careful planning. But as he was thinking, something else occurred to him. Last night, they had been so caught up in their heartfelt confessions that he had been completely swept away by Caleb's rare display of vulnerability. He was so emotional and overwhelmed that he felt like a fool for ever breaking up with Caleb. But after a night's sleep, his fevered brain had cooled down enough to remember another reason for their breakup. That jerk Caleb. If he loved him so much, why had he been so reluctant to touch him before? In a whole year, they had only slept together 3 or 4 times, a number you could count on one hand. Did that sound like 2 healthy, young college students? Was that normal? Anyone who heard that would think one of them had a problem. Julian's gaze turned resentful, and he shot Caleb a dirty look. Caleb had finished unpacking and was about to ask Julian if he wanted to go for a walk. He was met with Julian's glare and asked, puzzled, "What's wrong?" Julian just scoffed, not wanting to talk to him. Caleb assumed Julian was just being his usual difficult self. He was used to it. He took Julian's hand. "Come on, let's go for a walk. There's a scenic area nearby. I made a plan. I'm taking you out." Julian was dragged reluctantly out the door. He huffed to himself, "You don't even want to be intimate with me? Who wants to hold your hand? You have no romance in you." But after a couple of futile attempts to pull his hand away, he gave up. Julian's moods were fleeting. By the time they were in the elevator, he was leaning against Caleb's shoulder like he had no bones. The elevator doors reflected their images. They were wearing identical black hoodies that Sarah had bought for them. Both were tall and well-proportioned, though Julian was slightly shorter. Leaning together like that, they looked like they were wearing a couple's outfit. He took out his phone, snapped a picture, and showed it to Caleb, wagging his tail like a proud puppy. "Don't we look like a couple?" Caleb glanced at the photo and pulled him closer. "We don't look like one. We are one." Willow Creek was a coastal city with a humid climate and a slow pace of life, very different from Julian's hometown. It wasn't too cold in the winter, and the streets were clean. A walk along the coastline was like stepping into a postcard. Julian was always enthusiastic about exploring new places. He wanted to try everything, from the street vendors' wares to the tourist attractions and local restaurants. And so, he fell into every tourist trap. While Caleb was engrossed in studying a stone tablet next to a famous poet's former residence, he turned around to find Julian squatting by the side of the road, haggling with a vendor over a souvenir coin. Julian, with a look of fake shrewdness, said, "No, $20 is too much. 15. The vendor clutched his chest dramatically. "I've never met such a tough customer. You're killing me." All right, 15 it is." Before Caleb could intervene, Julian had already paid. The vendor pressed the coin into Julian's hand and quickly moved on to his next victim. Caleb pinched the bridge of his nose, walked over, and grabbed the back of Julian's neck. Julian turned and proudly showed him his new acquisition. "Look what I got. I even bargained him down by $5. Now it was Caleb's turn to scoff. "I heard," he said calmly, "that souvenir sells for $10 in the official gift shop." Julian looked like he had been struck by lightning. Caleb pulled him to his feet and dragged him into the historical residence. He declared grimly, "From now on, you are not allowed to be more than 3 feet away from me. If I see you buying any more of this junk, I'm cutting off your allowance for next semester." Julian looked aggrieved, but the $15 coin was still in his hand, so he had to reluctantly agree. But Caleb wasn't all strictness. After visiting the historical building, he took Julian to a dance performance. It wasn't a typical tourist show. A renowned dance troupe happened to be touring in the city. Caleb usually had no patience for such things. He wasn't a romantic person and didn't particularly enjoy music or dance. In another era, he might have been one of those stern scholars who condemned such frivolous entertainment. But Julian liked it, so he bought tickets for the best seats. Caleb leaned back in his seat. Everyone was captivated by the performance. On stage, under the dramatic lighting, a beautiful mythical water nymph and a handsome young fisherman were acting out a tragic farewell. But Caleb's gaze was fixed on Julian. Julian's eyelashes fluttered, his attention completely on the stage. The stage lights reflected in his eyes, making them sparkle like a river of stars. He sat upright, but he would sway slightly with the music. During the dramatic parts of the story, he would let out a small gasp. Caleb couldn't help but smile. He remembered the school talent shows when they were kids. Julian had watched with the same rapt attention. He reached out and gently pinched Julian's cheek. Julian, lost in the performer's mournful song, didn't react at first. He just turned to look at Caleb, a little dazed. "There's nothing," Caleb smiled. "I just think you're more interesting than the show." After the performance, it was already late. After dinner, Caleb and Julian took a walk along the beach. They saw a cruise ship offering night tours and decided to go aboard. They stood at the bow of the ship, the salty, damp sea breeze blowing in their faces. The sky was a black velvet curtain, and below it, the crowd was lively and noisy. Some people were even dancing on the deck. It was a picture of vibrant life. Julian leaned against the railing, the night wind tousling his hair, revealing his bright eyes. Caleb brushed a stray strand of hair from Julian's face and asked softly, "Did you have fun today?" Julian was unwrapping an ice cream bar he had just traded for a slice of strawberry cream cake from a woman. "Of course," he said, his voice sweet, probably from the ice cream. "I love going to new places. And I'm with you, so of course I had fun." "Good." Caleb smiled. After a moment, he added in a low voice, "I haven't taken you out like this in a long time. Actually, last year, I was planning to take you on a trip during the winter break, but I wasn't sure if I'd have the time, so I didn't say anything." He paused. "And then we broke up. But thankfully, after all the twists and turns, they hadn't drifted apart for good." Caleb added, "I'll take you to many more places in the future. Anywhere in the world, mountains or seas, wherever you want. When we retire, I'll travel the world with you." This was Caleb's version of sweet talk. It wasn't flowery or overly romantic, but steady and reliable, like an ancient mountain. And once he said it, he would definitely do it. Julian's eyes crinkled into a smile. "I want to go to Paris to see Oscar Wilde's grave." "Okay." Under the cover of the night, they exchanged a creamy, sweet kiss in the sea breeze. On the way back, Caleb went to buy some beer and snacks for Julian. Julian, wandering around, spotted a pink vending machine on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was a snack machine, but upon closer inspection, he realized it was selling something else entirely. Julian whistled. It wasn't chocolate or hot coffee. It was filled with all sorts of condoms, displayed openly for all to see. Julian's eyes darted around. Good, Caleb wasn't back yet. With lightning speed, he took out his phone, paid, and bought a handful of different kinds, stuffing them all into his backpack. Julian, clutching his loot, followed Caleb into the elevator. He was a terrible actor. When he was up to no good, his guilt was written all over his face. He might as well have tattooed it on his forehead. Caleb, holding the beer, looked at him suspiciously several times. He thought he saw Julian stuffing something into his bag when he came back. Now Julian was standing far away from him, clutching his backpack to his chest, his gaze darting away the moment their eyes met. Something was definitely off. Caleb asked, "Did you buy something just now?" That was the wrong thing to ask. Julian jumped as if he'd been stepped on. "None of your business," he snapped. "I'll buy whatever I want." Caleb raised an eyebrow, now certain that Julian was hiding something. But seeing Julian's defensive posture, he decided not to press the issue. It was probably another one of those ridiculous souvenirs, Caleb thought with a sigh. He had probably been ripped off again and was too embarrassed to admit it. But an hour later, he would find out how wrong he was. Back in the room, Julian was drinking beer and watching his favorite soccer team play. But his team was getting crushed 3-0. The fans in the stadium were furious, on the verge of rioting. Normally, Julian would have been yelling at the TV too. But tonight, he was unusually quiet. He had had more than 2 cans of beer. He wasn't drunk, but his cheeks were flushed. The TV was a cacophony of angry fans, but he was staring intently at Caleb. Caleb had already showered and was sitting nearby in a bathrobe, his profile sharp and defined. One hand was resting on the table, and through the open robe, a glimpse of his muscular chest was visible. He was incredibly sexy. Julian swallowed hard. He tugged at his t-shirt, feeling a little hot. He fanned himself and mumbled, "I'm gonna take a shower." Caleb, engrossed in his phone, replied without looking up, "Okay." Julian glared at him, then stood up reluctantly. But before going into the bathroom, he quickly opened his suitcase and backpack, took something from each, and snuck them into the bathroom with him. Caleb, busy replying to a professor's message, didn't notice. The sound of the shower ran for over half an hour. Then Julian spent another 20 minutes blow-drying his hair. He looked at his reflection in the mirror and felt the alcohol he had drunk earlier was finally hitting him. He felt dizzy. He stood there for a few more seconds. Then, taking a deep breath, he opened the door. Caleb was still in the same spot, but now he had his laptop out. The blue light from the screen illuminated his cool, handsome face, making him look aloof and ascetic. Julian walked over and sat on the table in front of Caleb. Caleb's view was suddenly blocked. He looked up and met Julian's defiant gaze. Julian was still damp from the shower, a warm, moist aura clinging to him. The shampoo he used had a subtle white tea scent, which, in the steamy air, seemed to create an intimate and alluring atmosphere. He was thinner than Caleb, and the same white bathrobe seemed a size too big on him. He was enveloped in it, like a pearl about to be revealed from its shell, lustrous and translucent. Under Caleb's watchful eye, Julian's fingers stiffly untied the bathrobe. He sat on Caleb's desk, looking like a pure, clean statue, yet at the same time, like a shameless siren, luring a passing scholar. Caleb leaned back in his chair, appraising Julian. The room was dark, lit only by the cold glow of the laptop screen. His face, illuminated by the light, was as cold as a snow-capped mountain, his expression unreadable. He reached out and hooked a finger under the thin black ribbon around Julian's neck. It was very fine, only half a finger's width, made of a soft, silky material with a faint pattern. It was tied a little tightly, as if it were about to press into his pale skin. At the bottom, a small green, teardrop-shaped pendant dangled, casting a shadow on Julian's collarbone. Caleb asked, in a tone one might use to appraise an antique, "What is this?" His fingers were cold against Julian's hot skin. Julian almost flinched. His shame was reaching its limit, and Caleb's calm demeanor was infuriating. He was starting to suspect that he had made a huge mistake. Caleb might really not be interested in his body. Julian closed his eyes, fuming. He replied irritably, "Stop playing dumb. Are you blind?" But in his current, vulnerable state, his anger lacked any real bite. Caleb chuckled. His hand slid down Julian's chest, then stopped at his thigh. He seemed to have discovered something new. He asked with a low laugh, "And what's this?" This time, Julian really wanted to find a hole to crawl into. What could it be? What could it be? That jerk Caleb was still asking, and he even flicked the high-quality strap with his finger, making a loud snapping sound. The sound pushed Julian over the edge. He opened his eyes, his patience gone. "Caleb," he said through gritted teeth, "if you keep pretending, I'm done for the night." He started to get off the table, but just as his feet touched the ground, a strong arm wrapped around his waist. His world turned upside down, the ceiling spinning before his eyes, and he fell into Caleb's lap. His lips were captured in a deep, passionate kiss. Caleb's tongue slipped into his mouth, and they exchanged a long, lingering kiss. It's beautiful. Caleb's voice was no longer calm and composed. His earlier composure had all been an act. He was even breathing heavily. He kissed Julian's chin, his ear, his shoulder. "You look beautiful in this." Julian was melting. He looked at Caleb, dazed. Caleb was still whispering praises to him. At first, he was reserved, his voice low and gentle. But then he became more urgent, his words becoming more explicit and raw. Julian felt like he was on fire. He looked at Caleb in near horror. Caleb still had that handsome, cool expression, making it hard to believe such vulgar words were coming from his mouth. But he liked it. Julian's shoulders trembled, but he was also a little ashamed. He tried to cover Caleb's mouth. Don't say that." But Caleb just laughed and asked, "Why not? You seem to be enjoying it." He ran his hand down Julian's back, his forehead beaded with sweat, yet he still managed to look in control. He knew Julian better than Julian thought. 2 hours later, Julian was lying on the bed like a limp noodle, completely still. Caleb was wiping his arms and legs, and he didn't even have the strength to lift them. Julian cursed weakly, "Are you a machine? If you have so much energy, why don't you become a track athlete?" He was starting to regret his little show. He had bought these things before he and Caleb broke up. They weren't anything too extreme. He had just been insecure, wondering if he wasn't attractive enough for Caleb. He hadn't expected the effect to be this dramatic. He felt exactly the same as he had when he woke up in the hotel room after their snowstorm incident. His whole body felt like it was falling apart. He had thought that time was a one-off, that Caleb had just been driven mad by his anger. But this time he was just as beastly. He looked dazedly at Caleb's refined, handsome face. "You," Julian started, then trailed off. Caleb, fully satisfied, was in a good mood. He asked gently, "What is it? Want to curse me out some more?" Julian had been cursing him non-stop for 10 minutes straight, even when he was out of breath. Julian shook his head. He looked at Caleb with a complicated expression, finally unable to hold back his question. "Weren't you unwilling to touch me before?" He hesitated, not sure how to phrase it. "When we were together. Every time I came to see you, and I wanted to do something, it felt like I was forcing you." At this, he couldn't help but pout, still feeling resentful. "I initiated and you still refused. It made me feel so unattractive," Julian said softly. "Why the sudden change?" A blank look crossed Caleb's face. He hadn't expected Julian to ask him this. He rubbed his nose. After their conversation on the terrace, he understood where their problems lay. His restraint, which he had thought was for Julian's own good, had come across as cold rejection. But now he was strangely reluctant to tell the truth. He had a feeling that if he did, the love he had just won back might fly away again. Caleb remained silent, and Julian grew impatient. He kicked Caleb with his sore leg. "Don't play dumb. Are you going to tell me or not?" His body was sore and tired, which made him irritable. Remembering the past made him angry at Caleb all over again. If his legs weren't so sore, he would have kicked Caleb off the bed. Caleb looked down at Julian. Julian was lying on the white sheets, his legs covered in purple bruises from Caleb's grip and kisses. He looked less like he had just made love and more like he had been assaulted. He took Julian's hand and lowered his head, his lips pressing against Julian's knuckles. "It wasn't that I didn't want to touch you. I was afraid to." Julian was completely confused. "Huh?" Caleb sighed. "Do you remember the first time we were together? I was too rough and I put you in the hospital." He had applied medicine for Julian the next day, but by evening Julian had a fever. He gave him anti-inflammatory pills but was still worried, so he had half-forced Julian to go to a private clinic for a checkup. The doctor was a senior from his university, very discreet and a close friend, which also made him brutally honest. "Is this making love or attempted murder?" His friend had said with a humorless smile, looking at him like he was a monster. "I didn't know you had it in you, Caleb. Is this your partner or your enemy? You did the examination yourself. You know how bad the tearing is. Be smart, let your partner rest." Caleb pursed his lips. He remembered sitting next to Julian that day, staring at the prescription for a long time. Julian was asleep on the examination bed, his face youthful and innocent, resting against his arm. He had touched Julian's face, feeling helpless for the first time. He was only 20 then, in his first relationship, and he had hurt his lover. And to make matters worse, Julian himself didn't seem to care, acting like it was no big deal, still wanting to cuddle and be close. Caleb said, "I wasn't unwilling to touch you. I was just afraid of hurting you again. You have no idea what I've fantasized about, from the time you were 15 until now. The things I've done to you in my dreams would be too dirty to say out loud." Caleb glanced at Julian. His eyes were calm, but they felt like a sharp blade, gently tearing at Julian's clothes. Julian swallowed, feeling like he didn't really want to know what Caleb had been fantasizing about. And he thought, it was also my fault.